you, Riley? What's going on?
Hey, going alright? How are you doing?
Not too bad, not too bad. Excited for this talk.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited as well. So, before we get too deep into this, if you, for people who are watching who aren't familiar, you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm Avi. I'm a medical doctor working in a research setting. I debate various empirical topics, philosophical topics as well. And yeah, we're here to talk about biological sex.
Alright, awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for being willing to come on the talk. Obviously, I'm doing research on this as well right now, so this is really cool to have someone in the medical field and studying this to be able to talk about what they know at the time and what kind of where your thoughts on the matter are. So really, kind of where I want to start is this idea of well, maybe we can start broadly and get into closing, right? So broadly speaking, like, where do you think is like the best place to kind of start with talking about like the nature of biological sex? Like, how do you think is like the best way to start when we're categorizing what biological sex is?
I think we should start with the nature of definitions themselves.
Oh wow! All right.
We're gonna start really fundamental and work our way up.
Okay.
Okay, sure. So the first thing to talk about, just going from the bottom and working our way up to the top. Anytime we make categorizations, we're making definitions. We're defining a category. We're defining what the sufficient or necessary or both criteria are to be within a given category. It's important to note that definitions are not propositions. What I mean by that is that they do not contain a truth value. It is possible for a definition to be incoherent. So, for example, you can have a self-contradictory definition, but it is not possible for a definition to be true or false. For example, when we define pi as the ratio of the circumference to the diameter of a circle, it does not entail a claim of any kind. It's simply a construct for our usage. Here, individuals are agreeing to use a given Greek letter to substitute for a given notion. A proposition, on the other hand, attempts to add new information, for example, by predication. If I say that pi multiplied by 2 times the radius of the circle is 25 inches, that's a proposition. It's capable of taking on a truth value, meaning it's capable of being true or false. Definitions are fundamentally social constructs. This is not to use the term social construct in a demeaning or belittling way. Social constructs are very valuable, and we would be in big trouble without using them. It's just to point out that there is no truth or falsity to any given definition. You may have heard, a caveat allows this, you may have heard that things are true by definition. For example, you may have heard that saying a bachelor is an unmarried man is true by definition. Well, yes, that's called an analytic entailment or an analytic truth, but it's important to note the subtle difference between the truth of the proposition a bachelor is an unmarried man that is true because of the definition. We define bachelor in such a way that it's an unmarried man, and the truth value of the definition itself, the definition that we're defining a bachelor as an unmarried man. The definition doesn't have a proposition. The fact that we say it's true by definition means something is true just because we're accepting the convention by the definition. If we agree on this definition, then it's true with respect to our agreement on this definition. Is that nuance appreciated?
Yeah, I think I can. So how are we going to tie this into a conversation? Okay, so like essentially like there are some things that people might just take for granted by virtue of like, oh, well that's just definitionally how it is. How's the scientific conversation about like biological sex then?
Sure. It's important to understand that when people get into the definitions, a lot of arguments happen about the definitions of what biological sex is.
Sure.
It's important to understand that none of the definitions are inherently true or false because they're not propositions. If someone says you're using the wrong definition, you have to ask them what they mean by wrong. And as well as if you say someone else is using the wrong definition, you need to clarify what you mean by wrong. If you mean false, if you mean true or false, it shouldn't mean that, because that's not, a definition can't take on that property. Now, it could take on a property of utility. It can generate less utility than others. So, for example, if every scientist, or the majority of scientists, are using the word cat to refer to a feline, and you use the word cat to refer to a dog, your definition isn't false. It's not incorrect. You can define a cat as a dog. That's fine. But there's no point of you doing that. You're out of the consensus of what everyone else is using as a definition, and therefore it's just silly to do it. Why would you do it?
And it would
So
also
when you say
generate like absurd or like unreasonable outcomes by most people's interpretation.
Absolutely. So it's important just to differentiate that between saying that their definition is wrong. You point out saying, okay, there's not a point of disagreement here. If I define by my definition, in other words, the content behind my definition, when I say this dog is a dog over here, you're not disagreeing with me, you're just using your own special word. And then they'll say, okay, yeah. So they're just constructs that we use to have this, to refer to a given content of our thoughts. So it's important to flesh out what the given content of our thought is, and understand that when we're using these definitions, what we're trying to do is we're trying to capture our thoughts to the best that we can, and in alignment with the experts in a various given field and how they're using it as well. For example, if I am interested in using medical definitions, I'm not going to look at it at dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster. I'm going to look at a source for how doctors are using various definitions. Same thing, if I'm interested in a legal definition, I'm going to look at how lawyers are using this given term. I'm interested in a philosophical definition. I'm going to look at how philosophers are using that term, etc.
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, well, I mean, like, that makes sense to me because, I mean, like, there's a couple ways to address this. I mean, like, first, I mean, like, there's the broad, I don't know, like, a turf argument that I hear a lot is generally that, like, oh, well, if you look in the dictionary, the dictionary definition for what it means to be a woman is an adult human female, right? And a lot of turfs will look at that as if, like, oh, well, that must inherently mean that in order that categorically that trans women cannot be women because they're not able to adopt this like quality of femaleness as they're trying to define it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll try to essentially, so like this is kind of going towards that idea that like, oh, well, just because like that's what the dictionary definition is, that doesn't mean that is what it means to be a woman, because we're only looking at because what you're using is very limited perception, and you're not actually looking at what, like, for example, people within like the sociological community or like the medical community are referring to when they are referring to women or females.
Exactly. Yeah. Sources like dictionary.com or Merriam-Webster, they are generally colloquial definition sources, and they don't capture a lot of the nuance and specificity that more refined definitions within given fields of specializations would capture. And so, just like when you're going to any other field of specialization, you're going to form your definitions based on how those experts in that field are using that term to capture the available nuance. You're going to do so. I don't see why you wouldn't do so with biology. Why biology would be an exception, or sociology, or any other field.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So actually, this is interesting because I've been doing some research, and I asked my dean to do some research into, particularly as this. I think that this relates to, and you can tell me if this is an incorrect kind of association, but I think that this relates to the idea of like the validity of scientific models, right? So let me ask you this question, right? Like, what gives a scientific model its credibility or its utility? Because I think that a lot of people will similarly look at like scientific models and think that just because something is a model, that automatically gives it credibility. And whereas it seems like a lot of the literature that I'm looking at seems to imply that rather it goes from like that a lot of the utility and the credibility of the model goes towards like how consistently it is able to predict like reliable outcomes and outcomes that we can get behind. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. No, you hit the nail on the head. So it depends what the purpose of the model is. It depends what you're trying to model, and ultimately it does depend on what you're modeling is modeling reality accurately. In other words, if your model is actually representing what is happening or what will happen, if it is actually accomplishing the purpose of the model. Making a model, anyone can make a model. Making a model, being models in and of themselves don't generate validity. That's not. You would have a lot of crazy reductives on a view like that. Models that are valid are models that actually represent reality in the way you're trying to represent it, or predict reality in the way you're trying to predict it. It all depends on the goal that one has created the model for. Generally speaking, models are created to predict given outcomes. For example, this is true for weather, it's true for climate change, and to the degree to which your model can make those predictions is the degree of how useful your model is. If your model can't make any predictions and the confidence interval is literally everywhere and it generates just as much upward as downward, well, your model's not that useful. If your model does have a very narrow confidence interval, it's very useful. If it has some confidence interval, some uncertainty, but generally speaking, it follows a general trend, it's moderately useful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So actually, maybe this is a good point to actually bring this into the conversation about biological sex. So what are the different, because I've been reading a lot of literature lately on like all of the different kinds of models on biological sex. There seems to be some that focus on chromosomes, there are some that focus on like more like a series of evaluations, whether it's hormonal, whether it's developmental. There are some that focus on like gamete production. So like broadly speaking, like what are the different kinds of models that exist on biological sex as far as you're aware?
Sure, we can talk about that. So let's start with chromosomal. So there are many different chromosomal definitions across different species. So the first thing I'll mention is that when we talk about 46XX or 46XY, that exists in mammals and humans. Not necessarily all mammals, but some mammals and humans. There are other chromosomal systems in birds, for example, and it's not necessarily always an X and a Y. But for the purposes of this definition, we'll be talking about humans. So classically, 46XX would be the chromosomal arrangement by which we would have a female, and 46XY would be a male. Of course, the obvious issue with this definition arises when individuals who are not 46XX, nor are they 46XY, are capable, and that yet they are capable of sexual reproduction. We would clearly consider them a given sex. Are they a third sex? Are they simply outside of the sex category? The implications of this definition require more information regarding how one categorizes these sexes. So there would be all sorts of hilarious reductivism on that. Another definition you may find
Also,
is not just with...
before we go on, just so we can categorize it, because there are some people, I didn't realize this until I looked it up on my own, but could you explain what a reductio is to the audience?
Sure. A reductio is there's several different types of reductios. Broadly speaking, it's a result of your view, to give an entailment of your view that leads you to a conclusion that you would not want to accept, or that its acceptance would be against the laws of logic. Well, there may be a number of different reasons why it wouldn't want to accept it. One reason is because it entails a contradiction, so it just violates the laws of logic. So if you can show that someone else's view entails a contradiction, that would be a reason they wouldn't want to accept their view, because of what logically follows from their view is another view that they don't want to accept. Another reason they may not want to accept it is just simply because it sounds ridiculous to them, and they don't subscribe to the view that follows.
Okay.
So, yeah, broadly speaking, it's demonstrating that what they are saying logically entails something else that they don't want to accept.
Sure. It's essentially like, it's kind of like a parade of horribles. Is maybe an analogy that I'm trying to analogize to things that I study, right? Like it's like, if you are going to come to this conclusion, then it would mean all of these other things that you clearly that no reasonable person would want from this model.
Yeah.
Okay,
exactly.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I just want to clarify clarify that.
Sure. Yeah.
So going back to the conversation.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
So we went over a chromosomal. You may also hear a definition not with respect to chromosomes or the chromosomal entailment of a given organism, but with respect to just the cells themselves. You may have heard of things like sex cells. So the gametic definition is actually not a definition for organisms. It's a definition just for gametes themselves. So what sex is the cell? A categorization system can be referred to as a sex with respect to themselves, the sex cells. The sperm cells are the male sex cells. The egg cells are the female sex cells. Very straightforward. It's not talking about an organism. It's not talking about an individual. It's just talking about the cell.
Okay.
There's also another definition you may hear of, which I term the gametic entailed definition. This is referring to an organism, not just a cell. And on this categorization schema, the gametes produced by an organism define its sex as a sufficiency criteria, not necessarily a necessity criteria. We can go over what that means.
Yeah. If you could, just for the audience.
Sure. So when I say, for example, just for this definition, you may, if I say as a sufficiency criteria, if you can produce sperm, you are a male. As a sufficiency criteria, you can produce eggs, you are female. What would not work as a response to this definition is to say, oh, so by your definition, people who are infertile are not male or female, right? You actually can't say that because they specify they're only talking about a sufficiency criteria, not a necessity criteria. So you can have a category and say, okay, here is a necessary condition to be in this category. It's not necessarily a necessary condition to be in the category. So, for example, there could be another way you could be in the category. So, for example, let's say I say, well, there's two ways you could be in the category of the male sex. You can, and I'm not saying I subscribe to this definition, I'm just using it for an example.
Sure.
You can have the ability to produce sperm, and if you have that ability, it's sufficient for you to be in the category of male. Or you have the ability, or you have a XY chromosomal array. If you have that, you are also. So what it means is that it's not the only way to be in the male category is to produce sperm. There are other ways of doing it. So we would say that these qualities are necessary but not sufficient qualities to be in a given category. So when someone just says that I'm defining a category with sufficiency criteria of the following, they're not saying that people who do not have these criteria are outside of the category. They may or may not be inside or outside of the category. You would have to specify down to the other conditions.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
Yeah. So gametic entailed is basically just, hey, listen, if you can produce male gametes like sperm or eggs, spermatozoa, and if you are a male, and if you can produce female gametes like ova, eggs, you are a female as a sufficiency criteria. So the gametes that you produce define as a sufficiency criteria your sex. Hermaphroditic organisms are both male and female, and by hermaphroditic, I am not talking about intersex. I am talking about a very specific condition in which an organism can produce both male and female gametes. That is a very, very specified term, and I want to make it clear to everyone that's not referring to intersex as a broad category. Now, so this definition refers to an organism, not as a single cell. Another thing you may see is just a broad secondary sex characterization.
Okay.
So secondary sex is based on just features that appear typically during puberty in humans. Examples of secondary sex characteristics include enlargement of the breast and widening of the hips in females, facial hair and Adam's apples, for example, in males. Notice how this categorization scheme is ordinal. We'll get into the different variables and what they mean. Individuals can be ordered from most masculine to more feminine, with many possible values of masculine and feminine between the two extremes of secondary sex characteristics. So this, there are different entailments. So if we're talking about the characterization of sex, we need to be very clear about what definition we're working with. What I'm going to pose is that all of these definitions result in sex being non-binary, or having some hilarious reductio. We can go into, at least one hilarious reductio. Okay. And we could go into, before we go into the nature of this, I want to go over the different types of variables. This is actually really important. So,
sure.
When we use words like bimodal distribution, non-binary, spectrum, a lot of this stuff tends to be used interchangeably, and they mean very, very different things. Mm-hmm. So for example, we'll go into why, but sex can be on a bimodal distribution, and it cannot be on a spectrum. Sex can be non-binary, and it can be not on a bimodal distribution at all. Sex can be on a spectrum non-binary and not a bimodal distribution. All these things mean different things.
Okay, yeah, we're definitely going to need to break this down a little bit.
Yeah. So let's go to the basics. So in order to determine, in fact, let me screen share my Discord screen with you.
Oh, yeah,
actually, we should. Actually, I don't know if I can do. Let's see. I can do that if I'm in a call. I think I might be able to stream in this channel. I don't know what the settings are in this Discord.
You should be able to. On the bottom, there should be like a button to share your screen.
Oh, yes. So let's see, screen. I have this all in my Discord, so I'll go live. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now. Let me know if it's coming through crystal clear.
Yeah, we should be able to see.
All right, awesome. Okay, and hopefully the chat can follow along.
The chat's gone for a second, but we'll come back to them. They can just be, they can talk to themselves for a moment.
Oh, okay, cool. So variable types. So the first breakdown we have is categorical and numerical, or otherwise known as qualitative and quantitative. We'll go into what they mean. Within categorical, we have nominal and ordinal. Numerical, we have interval and ratio. So types of data, discrete, so we can say they're quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative data can be measured with numbers, such as duration or speed. Qualitative data cannot be measured with numbers. They're non-numerical data. That is categorical, such as a yes-no response, or the type of eye color you have. Within the domain of qualitative data, you can have things like nominal data. Nominal data, what is nominal data? So nominal data is data that is not numerical. It also doesn't have any obvious order to it. So for example, if I say, what hair color do we have? Does someone have? It could be brown, it could be blonde, it could be black. There's no obvious order to the colors of hair. I mean, I guess you could impose some kind of color if you want. You could align it up with the electromagnetic spectrum and you can order it that way. But intrinsically, there doesn't really seem to be any order to this. To contrast with that, ordinal data is not like that. Ordinal data is also non-numeric, but it does have an order to it. For example, if I say first, second, third place, grade letters A, B, C, socioeconomic status, low, medium, high. These types of data are non-numerical, but they do have an order. So we understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative. Within qualitative, there's nominal and ordinal data. Okay? Quantitative data, within quantitative data, there's two different types as well. There's discrete and continuous data. Discrete data is contrasted with continuous data in the following way. Discrete data is numerical. However, the numbers, the values that a given variable can take on have discrete, values that that can't be broken down indefinitely. So, for example, if I say the number of home runs in a baseball game, how many are there? That's a discrete variable. You can't have 1.5 home runs in a baseball game. You can have one home run in a baseball game. You can have two home runs in a baseball game, but you're not going to have 3.76 home runs in a baseball game. The number of workers in a company, you're not going to have 1.5 workers in a company unless you consider half-time workers half a worker, but that's a whole different conversation. Number of students in a class, you're not going to chop up a student in half and say they're half a student. So we consider these things to be discrete data. Continuous data, on the other hand, is numerical. However, it can be broken down into decimal points endlessly. So, for example, the height of children, that you can be 3.5 feet, for example. You don't have to just be 1 foot or 2 foot. The square footage of a 2-bedroom house, the speed of cars. These are all examples that can be broken down into further decimal points. This isn't so relevant to the difference to the categorization schema of sex, but just for whatever it's worth, there's within continuous variables, there's also a subtype of data called interval or ratio. Interval data does not represent, so in interval data, the ratio does not represent a true meaningful ratio of the value being measured. So for example, if I use the Celsius degree scale for temperature, although 60 degrees Celsius can be yielded by multiplying 30 degrees Celsius by 2, 60 is not twice as hot as 30 is, because the 0 is not a true zero starting point. 0 degrees Celsius still has heat. In ratios, that value actually does hold true. For example, the Kelvin scale would be a ratio type of continuous variable because the 0 is a natural 0. It actually is absolute 0. And 60 degrees Kelvin actually would be twice as hot as 30 degrees Kelvin. Okay. Now that we have the basic overview of the types of data, we can go over to the other terminology that's being used. Let's talk about what it means to be on a spectrum. So when we say this is on a spectrum, or if someone says this is on a spectrum, what does it actually mean to be on a spectrum? So there's actually no perfect definition for spectrum. Older definitions such as a condition that is not limited to a specific set of values but can vary without steps across a continuum. So if you can just take on any value within a given numerical domain, that actually doesn't fully capture what we mean by spectrum, because discrete spectrums actually exist. So going back to the variables, to just define a spectrum as only being a continuous variable, that actually doesn't fully capture it. Here's why. So you'll notice that these examples in physics are all continuous variables, and they're all spectrums. For example, temperature. You can take on any of these values, and in between decimal points, go breaking down further and further. So that would be a continuous variable. That's a spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum, the wavelength of the light that is emitted, that can take on just about any wavelength, and you could break it down with decimals. So that we would say that's a continuous variable.
Sure.
So does that mean to be on a spectrum, the data needs to be on a continuous variable? Actually, no, because discrete spectrums also exist in physics. Here's an example of the, what this is the electron emission spectrum, the photon emission spectrum, sorry, of a hydrogen atom. So the emission spectrum of a hydrogen atom, you'll notice that there are only specific wavelengths that can be emitted. And that has to do with the fact that orbitals, the electron transfer when they get excited to higher orbital states and relax to lower orbital states, they're quantized. They contain quantized amount of energy. And so only certain photons with certain wavelengths can be emitted through this whole process. So you'll notice what's different about this and the previous one is that, yes, this is a spectrum, but you'll notice that only certain values can be instantiated. This is an example of a discrete spectrum. The variable is discrete. Not all values can be instantiated here. Okay. So now that we've gotten those two out of the way, now, well, when we say something is a spectrum, what it means. So far, it can be continuous. It could also be discrete. Now, here's the question. Can it be non-quantitative? Can it be qualitative if we say something's on a spectrum? So yes, it actually can. So complicating matters further, the word spectrum has been analogized and transformed to refer to types of data that are not even continuous or discrete. So, for example, in biology and medicine, antibiotic spectrum of activity is a component of antibiotic classification. Broad spectrum antibiotics are classified against a wide range of bacteria. Notice how that wide range of bacteria, based on the species of bacteria, that's not a continuous variable. They're names. It's nominal. There may be some way you could make it ordinal. You may be able to order it, the species some way, but there's no obvious way you would do that. You could impose some way. So at best, it's ordinal, qualitative ordinal, but really it seems nominal. So when we say something is on a spectrum, that can actually be quantitative. It could be qualitative, discrete quantitative, continuous quantitative, normal quantitative, and ordinal quantitative.
Wait,
Does this mean anything could be? Yeah, go ahead, sure.
Sorry. So going back to those, I just want to make sure. Can you go back to the previous?
Sure.
So it could be, I think you said nominal quantitative or ordinal quantitative. So you mean nominal qualitative?
Nominal qualitative, sorry. Yeah, nominal qualitative, ordinal quantitative.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, sure. Now, does this mean that anything can be on a spectrum? So, no, it doesn't. We haven't seen spectrum being used in science for things that don't involve a wide range of possibilities. At minimum, so when we describe something as a broad spectrum antibiotic, for example, we're not talking about anything numerical, but we do recognize that there is a spectrum of bacteria that can be killed by it. And what we mean is that there is, at minimum, a wide range of possibilities. If there's only a few possibilities, we wouldn't consider that a spectrum. We would just consider that, okay, there's A, B, and C, for example. That's not us. No one would consider that a spectrum. So the strictest form of defining a spectrum is a continuous quantitative variable. The more relaxed forms, but are still used in biology and medicine, would allow them to be used as qualitative variables, both nominal and ordinal. But at minimum, you really should have a wide range of possibilities to consider something on a spectrum. What constitutes a wide range of possibilities? That's a whole Socrates paradox I don't have the patience for solving. That's a whole. There's clear areas on each side. Like obviously, if there's only 3 possibilities, I wouldn't consider that a wide range of possibilities. If there's 100 or 1,000 or even like 20, 25, yeah, you can start making an argument that's a wide range of possibilities.
Okay. So it sounds like there's probably some kind of like a reasonableness kind of evaluation in there. Like, you want to be able to, go based off of like what the average person working in this profession would probably believe would account for enough variation to be able to be considered on the spectrum.
Yes.
Okay.
I agree.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Now when we say the word bimodal distribution, we'll understand how that's different. So, what is a bimodal distribution? A bimodal distribution is a form of a multimodal distribution in which there are 2 different modes. Makes sense. Bimodal, 2 modes. These often appear as distinct peaks or local maxima in a probability density function. The truest example of a bimodal distribution that has 2 modes is when the 2 modes are equal. Well, they're equally modal to each other, so clearly it's bimodal. But you don't actually have to have exactly equal modes in a bimodal distribution. Things are recognized as bimodal distribution when there's just 2 local maxima generally. So here's the key point. Categorical, continuous, and discrete data can all form bimodal distributions. It could be categorical, so it can be qualitative, ordinal or nominal. It can be quantitative, continuous or discrete, and they can all form bimodal distributions. Importantly, values that are not on a spectrum, meaning they cannot take on a wide range of possibilities, can also be a bimodal distribution. Let me give you an example. Let's say we have an island where there are only 3 possible types of fruit. There are apples, bananas, and cherries. Let's say in this island there are 48 apples, 48 bananas, and only 2 cherries. Is the type of possible fruit a spectrum? No, it's clearly not. There's only 3 possible types of fruit. Now, it's nominal data, named, there's no obvious order to it, and it can't take on a wide range of values, so it's not a spectrum. Is it binary? No, it's not binary. It's ternary, actually, because there's 3 possible values. Is it a bimodal distribution? Yes, there are. It is a bimodal distribution because there's 2 modes. The 2 modes are apples and bananas. They're equally the most prevalent value. There are clearly 2 modes, apples and bananas, in a data set with more than 2 possible values. So, just because something is a bimodal distribution does not actually mean that it's on a spectrum. So it's very important to realize the difference between saying something is a bimodal distribution and saying something is on a spectrum. There can be a variable that's non-binary, a bimodal distribution, and not a spectrum. I want everyone to understand this. It's very important we parse out all of these different types of definitions, because a lot of people say, we use the word binary a lot, we use the word spectrum a lot, we use the word bimodal distribution a lot. It's very important to realize that these 3 words mean 3 very different things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So basically, just kind of recap at this point, because so far we've kind of talked about the definition of what it means to be on the spectrum, right? And we've kind of addressed the idea that, so I think that a lot of people have a conception that in order for something to be a spectrum, that it has to have purely continuous variables. And we've gone over where that's not necessarily the case. And we've also gone over...
Not the case at all.
Not the case at all. Okay.
Yeah.
And then...
Discrete variables exist in physics.
Okay.
That are on the spectrum.
When we're talking about a bimodal distribution, whereas a lot of people might take that to be necessarily a spectrum, that's not necessarily the case.
Correct.
Yes.
You can have a variable that's a bimodal distribution that is absolutely not on a spectrum.
Okay, cool. I think that I'm caught up, and I hope that the chat is as well.
Awesome. So now so getting back to all of our definitions of sex that we talked about before, let's go through them again and let's answer the following question. Let's answer: is it on a spectrum? Is it bimodal? Is it binary? Let's answer those three questions for each of these definitions. So, chromosomal. So, if we say as sufficiency criteria, if you are 46XX and 46XY, then 46XX you're female, 46XY you're male. So, I mean, for me, the chromosomal definition has just reductios. The obvious problem is there are 46. You can have, so if a 46XX could produce sperm, for example, if we have an example where you have a 46XX producing sperm presenting male, everyone would consider them a male. Even the biologists, if they could father children. If you have just like if you have 46XY, and they would be producing eggs. The biologists, and they could mother children, especially. Biologists would consider them.
Okay.
It's just this idea of, from my perspective, the chromosomal definition does a good job at capturing what we mean by sex in the majority of the time, but I don't think it truly captures what we mean in all of the cases. And the easy reductio to it is just to say, okay, just use the gametic entailment reductio. Just to say, okay, listen, on the gametic entailment reductio, let's say you have a 46XX person producing viable sperm that has the phenotype of the male. Do you think that's a female or a male? If they say that it is a male, well, they've contradicted their own definition. If they say that it is a female, then, well, they've been consistent with their definition. I agree, that's true. However, the reductio is then they think females can biologically father children. Female only females who are female only can biologically father children. It's also not clear if one can be 46XX and 46XY at the same time. You could actually define it to be mutually exclusive. That's fine. But to me, the chromosomal definition just has an obvious reductio to it. And I don't think biologists look at individuals and consider them to be male or female just because of their chromosomes, nor do doctors, by the way. If I will tell you right now that if a 46XX individual was an individual who presented male, who produced sperm, who can father children, I don't know any of my peers who are physicians who would consider that individual a female.
Okay.
So, as far as primary sex definition goes. Gametic, it's important to understand with gametic that this is the definition that is as close to binary as you'll get. We should actually, before we even get there, just to take a break for a second and just go over what binary means, so we can actually answer. Actually, so binary means something specific to it. So to be binary means that a variable can only take on one of two given possibilities. All right, so I'll just say that again so it settles in. To be variable means that a variable that is binary if and only if all the possible values can only take one of only two possible values. Okay? Obvious analogy would be binary code. The possible values are 0 and 1. There is no possible value that's a 0, 1. There's no possible value that's a 1, 0. It's a 0 or a 1. There's no possible value that's a 2 either. You'll notice that this definition is about what is possible. It's not about what there is. So that's a little subtle difference that some people will like to trap you on. So, for example, if I have a ternary code just means that there are three possible values, usually 0, 1, and 2. And let's say in this hypothetical where I'm working with ternary code, I type in 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. I just type in a bunch of zeros and ones. Okay? However, it is still possible for me to type 2 into the ternary code system. Is it binary code or ternary code?
I mean, at this point, it has to be. I think that the correct answer, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think the correct answer would be to say at minimum it would be ternary code, right? Like we're not sure what exactly it is, just that we know that it isn't binary.
Yeah. And if I say that there's only, let's say I stipulate that there's only 3 possible values that can be entered into the code, then it would be ternary. We would say, okay, it's ternary. The fact, and the key important point here is to realize the fact that I didn't enter the 3rd value into the code doesn't somehow make the code now binary, right? Okay. If I'm working in the ternary code computer system and I only type in 1s and 0s, it's still ternary code. Because what it means to be ternary code is that there are 3 and only 3 different possibilities. It's about what's possible, not about what we observe that's there.
Okay, so you could have ternary code which would go on for like hundreds and hundreds of years and never produce a 3rd value, but as long as it has the potential of being able to produce a 3rd value at minimum, that would make it ternary code.
Yeah. And it's obvious to realize this with binary code. Like our computers work in binary code, but let's say for just hypothetically, someone just typed in 1 and no zeros were typed in, right? Does that make it unary code? No. It's still a binary. It's still a computer working off binary code. It's just no one typed in the 0. The 0 was never instantiated. Someone can just hammer that 1 for all of eternity. Into that computer that's working on binary code. The fact that we haven't observed the 0 doesn't actually make it unary code. It's still binary code.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's more about like the possibility or like the capacity of a system rather than what's directly observable. I mean, like what's directly observable will influence what's possible, at least to some extent, right? Like if we're able to observe 2 outcomes that we know it's not unitary, and if we observe 3 that we know at minimum, then it must be tertiary. But that doesn't necessarily tell us what is possible within a given system.
Yeah. So obviously, if we observe something, then it's possible, and we know it's possible because it happened.
Right.
So it tells us that we can confirm if something is possible by observing it, but we're not going to be, unless we have some argument or some, whether it be a logical argument or an argument from like the laws of physics or something, or some law of biology that to say it's impossible, only observing 2 sexes actually doesn't entail the impossibility of the 3rd one. And I will actually argue that we have observed more than 2 sexes, but notice how I don't actually need to make that argument by what the word binary means. The other thing I will really sensitize everyone to is things that are redundant and don't make sense to say. So, for example, and I have been guilty of saying this as well, and I'm going to stop saying this. The phrase "strictly binary." You may have heard this. That is a phrase that actually does not make sense. It's very it's redundant. If not tautologous. So it's like saying truly true. Binary, when you say something is binary, it means all of the values can only take one of 2 possibilities. There's no binary code that, this is a strictly binary code versus all the other binary codes that are also strictly binary codes. What it means to be binary is that, the word binary subsumes that strictly. It means every value. So when someone says, okay, sex is not strictly binary, but practically it's binary, like, no, you don't understand. Like, when you say the word binary, that word applies to all of the possible values. The word binary means it is a claim. To claim something is binary is a claim to say it is not possible for any value to take on anything other than one of 2 possible values. So when you say strictly binary, you're just using redundancy. You're just saying, you might as well say what he said was truly true or falsely false. It's just, No. Like, in fact, if you say something is not strictly binary, but it's generally binary, you actually produce a contradiction. It's like saying, in general, but not in all cases. In all cases, something can only take one of two possible values. That's actually a contradiction.
Right, because they're going to be, that naturally implies that there are some instances where it's going to be a third possibility, or there could be a third possibility.
Yep, and the word binary means that in all cases you don't have that possibility. It's a universal quantifier. The quantifier being for all x can only take the form of one of two possible values. So you would be saying, in some cases, x can take one of three possible values or more, and in all cases, x can take only one of two possible values. It's just a straight contradiction to say it's generally generally binary, but not always binary. It's just you just don't. It's a fundamental failure to understand what the word binary is.
Okay, I think that makes sense. So tying this back into the conversation, I think we were at gametic sense. So how's this tied into this conversation?
So gametic sex is strictly, I will say this, and I will go on record saying this. So I'm not going to say strictly binary, but it is as close to binary as it can be in the sense that we have, in anisogamous species, which means species that have different size gametes, we've only observed two gametes. That's true. Now, it's not true that we have a reason to believe that it's impossible to have a third gamete. So I would be agnostic on whether it's binary or not. I'm not going to claim that it is possible because I don't actually have an argument to suggest that it's possible like I do with other definitions. But more importantly, even if it was binary, this definition doesn't apply to individuals. It doesn't apply to organisms. Yeah. So the gametic definition is just a definition with respect to the cells themselves. So if we say a sperm cell is defined to be male, a gamete cell is defined to be male if it is a sperm cell. A gamete cell is defined to be female if it is an egg cell, right? Well, we haven't observed in humans, for example, we've never observed a third gamete. We've never observed a speg. Someone would say, oh, here's a fork, here's a spoon, a spork. Like, there's no, third gamete that's like this combination of a sperm and an egg. We've never observed that. That's true. We haven't observed a third value. I agree. Now, does that make it non-binary or binary? Well, I actually don't know because I don't have a reason to believe either way if it's possible or not. But even if it is binary, it doesn't apply to organisms. When we talk about what sex are you, what sex am I, we're not talking about what sex is this gamete cell in my body. That's a very different question. The question that a lot of people are interested in, if someone says, I'm interested in knowing what sex I am, or what sex you are, that's a very different question from, well, my sex is, the sex of this cell in my body. That's the answer I'm producing. You're just not answering the question. I'm not asking you what sex this cell in your body is. I'm asking you what sex you are as an individual, as an organism. So you can have definitions that apply to the sex of an organism. You can have definitions that apply to the sex of a given cell itself. It's important to realize that they're very different definition schemas for very different categorization. They're very different categorization schemes, and they apply to very different things. And a lot of times when I've gotten into debates, a move that some individuals will try to make is say, well, I agree that you've shown me that sex is not binary, but you're using sex to refer to bodies. You're using sex to refer to organisms. But if you understand what we're referring to, it is binary. I'm like, well, listen, I agree, but I actually don't agree because I don't know if it's possible. But listen, we are talking about the organism. We are talking about the individuals. We're talking about the bodies, and so are biologists, by the way. They don't just talk, when they use the word sex, they're not only referring to the sex of a gamete, they're referring to the sex of an organism as well. They have there's a different categorization schema for that. So it's important to realize when you're talking about sex, you can talk about sex with respect to a cell itself, a gamete. You can also talk about sex with respect to an organism. And just, you have to be clear about what you're talking about that word with respect to. And I start off the bat many times to say sex with respect to an organism is non-binary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it actually does. It's interesting because I was reading a book earlier. I can link it to you, but I mean, like, it's interesting because, like, I'm starting to see a little bit more in the academic literature the idea that, like, when we're talking about sex, I think that a lot of people think of it in, like, a very, like, specific, it can only apply or only applies in, like, one specific sense, when it seems to be that there's a growing consensus that sex seems to apply to categorize a lot of different variables or parts of either the body or cells, or in between, right? Like, rather than looking at, like, what is the single categorization of someone, because that seems to lead to, I guess, reductias, if we're using a language, right? That it might be more accurate to look at sex in reference to, like, for example, either cells or, like, specific aspects of a person, if that makes sense.
Yeah. You have to just break down what you're referring to. Okay, so what definition are you operating by? What is your definition referring to? Is it referring to cells? Is it referring to an organism? What exactly is it your definition meant to categorize? So the thing that your definition is categorizing is important.
Yeah.
If you're operating with a definition that's categorizing organisms and they're operating with a definition that's categorizing cells, you have a fundamental, you're going to just talk past each other. You have to say, hey, no, listen, I'm just asking about organisms, not cells.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, gametic entailed. This is, so I'll just tell you right now that gametic entailed, what I'm naming as gametic entailed, this is the most common, if you argue with any TERF, or any of the whole wisdom of TERFdom.
Sure.
In TERF City, you will get this definition. This is the definition you're going to get.
Okay.
Or something close to this. There's like variations on this, but this is what you're likely to see. So, gametic entailed is the gametes produced by an organism defined as sex. Males produce small gametes, sperm, while females produce large gametes. Individual organisms which produce both male and female gametes are termed hermaphroditic. Hermaphroditic organisms are both male and female. Okay. Now, what they will argue is they will say, okay, so if you produce sperm, you're a male. If you produce eggs, you're a female. Is a sufficiency criteria. So you can't say the whole non-fertile to me, because I've set up the sufficiency criteria. And since there's no third gamete, guess what? It can only be male or female. Right?
Okay.
Cool. That's what they'll say. It's wrong. It's not true, but that's what they'll argue. They're not going to use the secondary sex definition because it's very just blatantly obvious why that's not fine.
Right.
Yeah. So this is what they're going to argue. Okay, cool.
Now, I will ask you later on because I'm interested in, and I think this is naturally where the conversation is going, but why they would use this definition, or like what makes a definition more preferable, or like which makes one more valid than another. It may relate to a conversation that we had earlier.
Yeah.
But I'm definitely interested in like both the why that they use this, but I don't want to like steer away from where you were originally planning to go with this subject.
Sure. Yeah. So just real quick, so the validity of a definition, I don't. To me, that's that may be a category error of terms. So validity is a property of arguments. So it's not a property of definitions.
Okay.
So arguments are valid. Yeah. No worries. Arguments are valid if and only if the conclusions are true, then if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. If that is the case, then the argument is valid. Definitions don't have truth values. I don't think they don't have validity. By the way, it's another thing we should, in my view, stop doing. Now, maybe people will disagree with me for saying this, but I actually think we should stop using the word valid for a lot of things we use the word valid for, including to refer to people. So they like, am I valid? Or if someone says I am valid or I am not valid, like you're not valid. Like I think both of these individuals don't actually understand what the word validity is. I understand you're trying to use it and analogize it to some other purpose, but validity has a very specific meaning. It refers to it's a property of an argument.
Right. Well, actually, so if I could, because if we're breaking it down, I understand I probably use it improperly there. My understanding of the word validity, at least if we're talking about like syllogisms, philosophical argument, is that as long as it as a premise, like if we're talking about a premise, and the premise fits within a larger argument, and if each premise, if true, leads to consistent outcomes, or like the outcome that the argument is supposed to produce, that is what makes something valid. That's what makes a premise valid.
So the premise wouldn't be valid. It's the property of an argument. So the premises are propositions that can be true or false.
Okay.
So their statement. The proposition is a statement that can be true or false. So for example, if I say, it's raining outside, that is a statement that is capable of being true or false. If I say, how are you? You'll notice that's a statement, but that's not a proposition, because how are you is not capable of being true or false. So what a premise is, fundamentally, is a statement that is capable of being true or false. So that's what we call a proposition. It's capable of having a truth value. So it's not a question like, how are you doing today? It's not, aha, it's not an exclamation. That's not capable of being true or false. It's a specific statement that has the property of having a truth value, or having a truth value of true or false, being able to be true or false.
Okay.
Validity, what it means to be valid, means in an argument structure, which an argument, what it is two or more premises and a conclusion. It's a set of premises with two or more and a conclusion, and it's valid if, so that argument is valid if the premises are true. So if it is the case that all the premises are true in the argument, then the conclusion must follow. The conclusion must also be true.
Okay.
If that is the case, the argument is valid. So premises aren't capable of being valid. They're capable of being true or false. An argument is capable of being valid. It's also capable of being sound. So an argument that is valid is an argument where if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. An argument also takes on the property of soundness when a valid argument also has true premises. So not only is it the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true, it is also the case that the premises are all true. Okay. Then it's a sound argument.
So, for example, we can have situations where you can have an argument which is valid internally, but which may not be sound in that, like, even the premises, even if you lay them out